Hey, I'm here with Margot Delafoulhouze from Climateworks Centre. She just told me I wasn't allowed to say Climateworks Australia. I would get in trouble with her comms team, so I'm glad I got it right, Margot.
Yeah, well done. Well, that and pronouncing my name well.
There you go, kicking goals already. So we're here at our last stop of this incredible site visit we've been doing, site tour we've been doing around Germany. We're here at an apartment complex. We've been looking at an amazing retrofit project, but we're not actually here to talk about that. We're here to talk about Margot's insights from the trip, and it's been an incredible 4 days, and there's so much to unpack. But what are some of the key things that stood out for you, Margot?
I think the first thing that really stood out for me was the importance of targets as a critical policy instrument and having targets that are appropriate, ambitious and legislated. And Australia is now having targets, but what really struck me is that not only do we need an ambitious long-term target for carbon emissions that's aligned with the Paris Agreement, but also to really drive government and private sector action, we need energy efficiency target for each sector, and that are not too long term. We need the more immediate term and medium term targets. And I think that really struck me how all the public servants we have met here, but also the bankers at the KfW, and even the private sector representatives we saw all mentioned those targets.
Well, they mentioned those targets and how they were doing against them, because not only did they set targets, as you say, overarching targets for energy efficiency, but then targets by sector. They track them every single year.
That's right. Yeah.
And so you've got this sense of kind of accountability and transparency around how we're doing, and that is just something that we don't have in Australia. We've obviously had a high level target without a lot of ambition. We've now got a target with a bit more ambition in it, but I guess one of the takeouts from this trip is there's a lot of value in having those granular targets that sit below that.
Yeah, and I'll give you a hint. Climateworks research actually sets some targets and some more granular targets. And for example, for the building sector, our research shows that the energy efficiency of buildings has to improve by 50% by 2030 compared to 2020. So we have to have energy consumption in buildings by 2030.
And I suppose that goes to the value of having some of those sectoral targets, right? Because it starts a conversation about, I guess, the relative speed of transition in different sectors of the economy. I mean, just last week, the Energy Transitions Initiative at Climateworks Australia released their Stage 2 report, looking at hard-to-abate sectors in Australia. We've got a lot of those, whether you're talking about steel or cement. There's a bunch of others. And the reality is that that's going to take some time to decarbonise those sectors, whereas in buildings we've got the technology. We don't have to sort of lock ourselves in a room and think deep thoughts about how we're going to decarbonise these sectors. It's actually about deployment, and we need to do it really quickly.
That's right, and maybe I want to pick up on a couple of things here. The first thing, I think, another key takeaway for me is moving from a very incremental approach to a more outcomes-based approach, and we know what the future needs to be, and it's net zero. We know what we need to do, so we need to shift from that increment, a little bit of change every couple of years or 3 years maybe, to actually define the norm as the gold standard and set the pathway to get there. That was the first thing. The second thing is, for buildings in particular, our modeling shows that the building sector is the first cab of the rank, and it has that critical role in achieving net zero for Australia, that the building sector needs to get to zero by 2035. And I just want to unpack that a little bit, because I think it can be a bit daunting. It's like, why should the building sector carry that weight of being the first cab of the rank? And just to explain, this modeling is a cost-based modeling. So the reason why our modeling ends up saying building sector, you get there at 2035, you're the first cab of the rank, it is because it is the most cost-effective pathway, because the technologies are already there. they're mature, commercially viable, they just need to be massively deployed.
Yep.
And so if we take that pure cost effectiveness lens,
Yep.
this is where the modeling takes us, and this is why the building sector should and can
Yep.
get there earlier than all the other ones.
Yeah, 100%. And I suppose, to sort of pick up your point around defining the task, we were talking about the National Construction Code this afternoon. We've sort of got this habit of doing incremental improvements really every 6 years. And it's just not going to cut it. And, effectively what we've got to do is have a trajectory with an actual end point. Incredible work done by the trajectory team over the last number of years. But, it's a bit, something that we need to work on is defining where we want to get to, which is ultimately net zero ready buildings, right?
Yes.
And we should be getting there as quickly as possible. And there's some interesting insights from Germany about how we might do that.
Yeah. So I think to that point, for the trajectory, there is amazing work being done. But again, for example, it's not particularly legislated. So that's also why there's a struggle or a really important effort in motivating every change.
Yeah.
And in fact, the building standards haven't been upgraded in more than a decade. So it's more than 6 years. But typically for buildings, if we are to get to zero in 2035, it means that we need to have a building code that is the zero carbon building code that is implemented by the end of the 2020s. Sorry. So that by the beginning of the 2030s, zero carbon buildings are the norm, not only in new buildings, but also increasingly in existing buildings that need to be renovated.
That's the other big takeout, right? So new build important, but fixing the buildings we've already got incredibly important. And while there's pros and cons to the approach that Germany's taken to this space, they have made an incredible investment, and they've been focused on it for a good decade and a half, and they've built an ecosystem of skills, of supply chains, of finance, which enables transformation in the existing building space. And that's something that they're looking to ramp up over the next number of years.
Yeah, and I think what we have learned collectively as a group is that there's a right choreography about standards and subsidies or zero interest loans, and it feels like standards can really lock in market performance and ratchet it up and improve it, but that also a certain amount of subsidies can really help triggering the market, but they need to be timed well.
I love your word orchestration, because it's about not thinking them as sort of parallel things or sort of, I guess, a binary choice, but how to coordinate that. So if there is going to be taxpayer money deployed, use it to support industry, to get familiarity with new building approaches, to certain types of upgrades, to novel technologies that may be mature in other sectors but not common in Australia, but then with a view to saying, well, we have invested in building out that ecosystem. We're actually going to expect it moving forward and have that interaction between support for industry to go on that journey as quickly as possible, but then back it in with sensible minimum standards and regulation down the track.
That's right. And I think another thing I would add is if there is taxpayer public money being spent massively on subsidies and zero interest loans, it also probably should be targeted to increasing the social benefits of that and to lower socioeconomic households to really help them upgrade their homes, because this is probably where we will get the biggest impact, not only in terms of climate, because often they live in the least efficient homes, but also in terms of health and social benefits.
All right, well, we're brimming with ideas.
We could keep talking forever.
We could keep talking forever, but we're real exciting to bring all these insights home to Australia. It's been an amazing trip, and it's been amazing having you along with us, having all the expertise sort of behind you of the Climateworks Centre. Looking forward to continuing to work together to translate some of these insights into action when we get home to Australia.
Let's get to action, and thanks, Luke, for having me part of the trip. It's been really great.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks.